Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Helen Miller. I'm a Deputy Director at the IFS. Thank you for joining us for today's event. We have a fascinating discussion lined up for you today, I think. We'll be talking about the financial impacts of COVID on local government, about how councils have been responding to help communities and businesses, and what they need to do in relation to the recovery. So the format for today is nice and simple. We'll first be hearing from David Phillips. He's an Associate Director at the IFS and he leads all of our work in this area. He's going to speak for about 25 minutes, setting out some of the research on how COVID has affected council spending and income so far, and then looking forward to the financial issues and choices that are still to come. You're then going to hear some short remarks from our four panellists, who I'm going to introduce now, and then you'll hear from them in this order after David. So we're going to hear from Nicola Morton, who is Head of Finance for the Local Government Association. Then from Councillor Richard Watts, who is speaking to us as leader of Islington Council. From Kamal Panchal, who is a Senior Advisor at the LGA. And then last but not least, from Andrew Carter, who is Chief Executive of Centre for Cities. We'll finish at 5:15, so the speakers, so after the speakers, we'll have time for a Q&A and some discussion. And I'm going to be looking to you for your questions. So please do use the Slido link that you've been sent, or that should be wherever you're looking at this video, to post your questions and to upvote the ones you'd most like the answers to, and I'll use those to help form the discussion. But for now, without further ado, let me hand you over to David.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Helen. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today for what I hope will be an informative presentation and discussion. So over the next 25 minutes or so, I want to look at three main questions. First, how and why has the COVID-19 crisis affected councils' finances? Second, what is the medium-term outlook for council funding? And third, what big issues and choices loom? And in doing all this, I will touch upon the economic effects of COVID, as alongside the extra expenses associated with the public health crisis, the economic crisis has had a big impact on councils and their funding as well. But before doing that, though, I think it's important to place the financial issues councils are now facing in a longer run context. And that is that councils have already seen a near decade of austerity that only really started to ease in the last 18 months or so. So overall spending on services last year was down 17% in real terms since 2009-10. And to protect spending on social care, many services like housing, culture and leisure, and planning development saw cuts of 40% or more by councils. And of course, an increase in population means that spending per person has fallen even more, about 23% overall, over 50% for some service areas. Now, this year was due to be the year the financial pressures eased somewhat, at least temporarily. A £1 billion increase in funding for social care and 4% council tax increases were projected to mean a 4.3% above inflation increase in funding for councils. Now, this would only undo about 1/3 of the peak to trough fall in total spending and just 1/5 of the peak to trough fall in spending per person. But in normal times, this quantity of extra funding would have been more than enough to keep pace with the underlying increases in demand and costs, allowing councils to put some services on a more sustainable footing, for example, by tackling understaffing or overly low fees for certain suppliers, but also make some modest improvements to the range and quality of services they offer in a few instances. Well, that was the plan. But then, this, the SARS-CoV-2. This virus has generated a new perfect financial storm, really, for councils. The associated public health crisis has increased costs and led to a range of expensive new responsibilities. There is a brewing social crisis with lockdown and social distancing, but also looking ahead at the long-term effects of ill health and unemployment, which we know can be very long-lasting. They're likely to all increase demand for a range of services, social care services, public health services, housing services. And the associated economic crisis has hit councils' revenues from local taxpayers, service users, and commercial and investment activities. Now, of course, COVID-19 has affected people's behaviour and the economy in many ways, and many of these have implications for councils' revenues. So let's just look at 3 examples. This first graph shows data from Google on the amount of time people spend in 3 kinds of places: retail and leisure destinations, transport hubs, and workplaces. And you can see that the amount of time spent in such locations fell by up to 80% during the height of the first lockdown. It then did recover, but even in the middle of summer, remained about 20 to 40% below pre-COVID levels. And whilst this data doesn't quite show it because it stops, unfortunately, on the 3rd of November, it's likely fallen again during this new lockdown in England. Now, these sorts of changes in behaviour can affect councils in several ways. Less income from car parks, leisure centres and commercial waste services, and difficulties in collecting business rates, as well as rent from investment and property developments. That's clearly an issue in the short term, but it could also become a longer term challenge if these changes in behaviour persist after the COVID crisis abates. And I think we're already seeing growing signs that some of these changes, a shift to online shopping or changes in work practices, they may persist at least in part. So councils could be facing more permanent reductions in their income going forwards. This second graph shows another facet of the crisis, the huge numbers of workers that have been furloughed. Almost 9 million in April and May, 3 to 4 million during August, and probably about 2.5 million just before the latest lockdown, when numbers have almost certainly jumped significantly again. Now, as well as affecting, business and flows to sort of commuter areas, which will impact again on parking income, transport income, maybe business rates, many, if not most of these people on furlough would also be on reduced pay, increasing the eligibility for council tax discounts or simply making it harder to pay bills. So council tax revenues have also been affected by this crisis. And while furlough did stop a much bigger fall in employment and increase in unemployment, employers have reduced the numbers on their payroll by about 2%, with most of that taking place back in March and April. That's over 500,000 fewer people on payrolls, again potentially impacting on councils' council tax revenues. In London, the fall in employment has actually been closer to 4% and continued right through the summer, which actually could reflect the sort of knock-on effects from the reduced commuter flows I talked about, reducing demand for hospitality and support services. And I think this kind of graph here, the difference between the UK figures and the London figures, reminds us that more generally, the scale of the economic effects of COVID have differed at least somewhat around the country. For example, these maps from a recent publication by colleagues show areas whose economies have been particularly affected by the COVID-19 crisis so far, in purple. Areas with poor education, employment, earnings and health outcomes that might be termed left behind, those are shown in green. And areas that are in both categories are shown in red. Now, what the map shows is that those areas with the greatest short-term economic impacts actually do include parts of London. That might, be one of the factors driving those bigger falls in employment in London. But it also includes many coastal and rural areas, reflecting the reliance on the hospitality industry. Interestingly, most left behind areas aren't among the areas most economically affected by COVID, at least initially. That can reflect the fact that the hospitality sector is generally smaller in these more deprived areas. There's more reliance on the public sector for employment. And of course, that's held up and in some cases increased during the crisis. But what you can see is there are some relatively poor coastal communities And certain cities like Manchester, Liverpool and Newcastle have been both hit harder by COVID so far and already had poor economic and social outcomes. And there can be particular concern about prospects for recovery, especially in the cities in the years ahead, and what that means for the levelling up agenda. Now, data also show the effects of local COVID restrictions on consumer behaviour. And this figure, again using data from Google, shows a significant dip in visits to retail and leisure destinations in Leicester during its restrictions in July. And more recently, there is some evidence of a smaller dip, at least, in Liverpool when it entered the old Tier 3 restrictions. Now, with a few more days of data, we'd see all these latest dips being massively outweighed by the big falls by second lockdown. But I think one of the lessons from this is that when we exit national lockdown in December, if we return to different rules in different places, depending on the prevalence of COVID, which could be a sensible strategy overall, we may expect to see similarly differential changes in economic behaviour and hence different pressures on different councils. I think data also show clearly that the exposure of different councils to these economic and financial risks, as well as councils' resilience, does differ. So even for a given size hit, different councils will be able to cope with that to different extents. And that's because the extent to which they rely on especially affected revenue streams, like income from parking and leisure facilities, commercial investment activities, that differs very substantially across councils. And councils differ a lot in the levels of financial reserves they hold and the commitments on their budgets, the things that are hard to wiggle out of, like debt interest payments, debt repayment, PFI, spending on social care and very acute services. So to look at these patterns of risk and resilience, we published a dashboard back in the summer that collates various measures of these for each council. Red indicates higher risk and lower resilience, and green vice versa. Now, of course, it's not a complete assessment. Qualitative factors like the quality of management and governance will matter. But these economic, social and financial metrics all are a useful starting point for considering the risks different areas face. So what I'm showing here now is the dashboard for Croydon, which is one of the councils which seems to be facing particular difficulties at the moment, unfortunately. And we can see here that its reserve levels are especially low, and a high share of its budget goes on social care services, things that people very much rely on. So both these factors may have reduced its financial resilience, made it more prone to being particularly adversely affected financially by the COVID crisis. Now, as we have Councillor Watts joining us later in this event, let's also take a look at Islington. You can see in the dashboard that its reserves are also relatively low, but actually much higher than in the case of Croydon. One of the differences is that it actually relies more on income from parking and leisure and culture, though. And these are income sources that have become under sort of particular pressure during the COVID crisis and actually may take a long time to recover. So different risk factors in different councils. And if you want to find out your council, where you live, you can go to our website to look at the dashboard. Now, zooming back out from that very local picture, what is the national picture for councils' finances this year? Well, despite additional funding from central government, it does look like to us that councils were facing unmet income and spending pressures even before the new lockdown measures. Forecasts councils made in September, so before the big surge in cases, well, they imply that spending this year will be about £5.4 billion higher due to the COVID-19 crisis. Now, there's a range of different factors underlying that, widespread increases in spending across different services. The biggest element is adult social care. Councils forecast about £2.5 billion more on adult social care spending this year, with most of this due to either extra demand for people requiring care or higher payments to suppliers to pay for the extra costs of maybe PPE or re-rotering staff so that they are traveling less between clients, potentially spreading the disease. But there's also been substantial increases in spending on a range of other services, about 0.3 billion extra on each of children's social care, public health, culture and leisure, and environmental services, which includes cremations and cemeteries, and also waste collection. Quite different service areas there, of course, coming out of that category, but they've seen pressures across that area of environmental services. Another factor councils have raised is they've not been able to achieve the efficiency savings they were hoping for this year. About 0.6 billion of the spending pressures are down to that. And councils also responded to new needs and new responsibilities. They're spending over £250 million on the test and trace system at a local level. That's on top of the national programmes. 155 million to house and support rough sleepers. 91 million pounds on support for those shielding, and about £6 million a month on providing food and food parcels to vulnerable families that may have slipped through some of the gaps in the welfare safety net. Non-tax income will be about £2.8 billion lower, according to council's forecasts. About 2 billion of that is due to a reduction in sales fees and charges income, with losses in parking income and leisure and culture income being the two biggest components of that fall. And also about 0.8 billion due to a reduction in commercial, investment and other income. That includes, income from commercial services, from development and investment properties. And one of the things that's really notable here is that the impacts vary massively across councils. Some councils do much more of this commercial activity, investment activity, than others, and therefore are much more exposed to this source of income loss. Examples include those councils that rely a lot on income from airports, such as Manchester or Luton. And I should say, actually, that councils have been able to claim support from the furlough scheme to address some of these losses in commercial and sales income, but it only offsets about 35 million. So, less than sort of 2% of the overall losses in income are offset by furloughing staff. Now, what this means is that the in-year financial pressures councils are facing are just over £8 billion this year. The government has provided significant additional funding to councils, both in the form of grants and via other means, such as a scheme compensating for some of the reduction in sales fees and charges income they faced. Government is sharing in those losses. But even after accounting for this, our current estimate is that the pressures could exceed this funding by about £1.1 billion this year. Now, it's important to bear in mind this figure is very uncertain. On the one hand, it's not always clear what pressures councils have included in their forecast, and hence what funding to include in these calculations. There's a particular issue about some funding for social care, and whether councils are including all of it or just the part they can keep themselves. Now, these figures, and the figures I think Nicola will talk about shortly, assume they are only including the figures for their own funding, not the part they pass on to private care homes. But if they had included all the funding, actually the shortfall could be a bit smaller this year. On the other hand, the forecasts were from September and implied that spending and income pressures in the second half of 2020-21 will be much lower than the first half. Now, with a major second wave of COVID and a new lockdown, that may not be the case. Pressures might continue. And if so, the gap could also be higher than existing forecasts imply. It's also worth emphasising that the scale of any unmet pressures and the ability to address these will vary across councils, reflecting the patterns of risk and resilience we just discussed a minute ago. And this, I think, makes targeting additional support to councils quite difficult. Generic formulas for funding will give too little to some councils, but too much to others. And that means, I think, a real role for more targeted measures, such as compensation schemes for the cells' income, and also additional flexibilities over borrowing for those councils that have particularly low reserves levels and may not get enough through the sort of general funding that's being provided. Looking to the future, councils are also facing a medium to longer term funding gap, with spending needs set to increase faster than available funding. This figure shows our medium-term projections for the funding gap, assuming that council tax is increased by 2% a year and funding by government is increased in line with inflation, which is broadly consistent with what sort of pre-COVID sort of financial plans were implying. Now, if that was the case, if there were no updates to those plans, our central projection is that the funding gap for councils would grow to about £3.3 billion by 2024-25. And this assumes that the only long-term impacts of the COVID-19 crisis are modest reductions in income from parking and transport services and business rates, and a small increase in the cost of council tax discounts for the unemployed. It doesn't build in any long-term effects on the demand for services, for example. And of course, the future is highly uncertain, and the gap could prove much larger if the COVID-19 crisis has bigger impacts, if demand for services increases, and if productivity in local government falls. Alternatively, the gap could be much smaller too, if the economy recovers very strongly from the COVID crisis, and if demand for services slows and productivity grows faster than has historically been the case in local government. Indeed, growth in demand for and productivity of council services are likely the most important factors going forwards. COVID matters a lot, but when you look to the kind of medium to longer term, it is the demand, the underlying demand for council services and the productivity which councils can deliver them, that is the real driver of the spending pressures and then the potential size of the funding gap. Now, we've also examined a number of additional pressures that councils may feel that they're facing. Feel that they're facing over the next few years. And that includes the cost of addressing existing underfunding of adult social care providers. Now, if you include that, the funding gap in our central scenario goes from sort of £3.3 billion to £4.9 billion. And I think Nicola Morton from the LGA will talk more about these additional costs in her panel discussion later. Now, when thinking about the potential to get revenues, local government will be competing with other areas of the public sector for funding. And that's taking place in the context of a really quite weak outlook for the country's overall public finances. Even prior to the COVID-19 crisis, the OBR was forecasting that government borrowing would actually increase slightly over the next 5 years to between 2.5% and 3% of national income. The economic effects of the COVID-19 crisis are likely to push that figure much higher, not only in the short term, but in the medium term too. And this is because the economy is likely to be permanently smaller than we previously thought. And this year, of course, the government was on course to spend almost £200 billion on public health and economic support measures to help tackle the COVID crisis, even before it announced it was extending the furlough scheme until the end of March, which could cost tens of billions of pounds more. Now, even if all these extra policy measures finish at the end of the March, which is far from certain, our central projection is that government borrowing will actually be around 6% of national income in the medium term, which is about £81 billion higher than our forecast back in March. Now, there is significant uncertainty about this, both about the path of economic recovery and the extent to which extra spending is sustained. So the increase in borrowing could be many billions higher or lower. But I think it is clear that borrowing looking ahead is going to be much higher than we previously forecast, meaning a difficult set of decisions for the government looking to the future. Based on the central projection, for example, without any changes to the pre-COVID tax and spending plans from 2021 onwards, debt would be on an unsustainable path. So in a few years, action will definitely need to be taken. Even enacting an £81 billion fiscal tightening using some combination of tax increases or cuts to spending plans by the middle of the 2020s, which would offset the increase in borrowing in full, even doing that would see debt remaining above its pre-COVID levels until 2040. And a fiscal tightening of 40 billion, offsetting half of the increase in borrowing, would see debt stabilise at about 110% of GDP. Now, this wouldn't be too costly if interest rates remain at very low levels, but it could pose a much bigger issue if interest rates increase. And that's because each 1% increase in the interest rate would push up spending on debt interest by almost £20 billion a year, making servicing that debt substantially harder. Now, what does this mean for councils, this sort of big picture public finance view? Well, I think that it means that another round of fiscal tightening is on the horizon. During the 2010s, most of this was delivered by cutting public service spending. This time round, such an approach, I think, is pretty unlikely, given that many services, including local government, has already seen a near decade of austerity. Instead, it seems likely that there'll be more tax increases, and they will do more of the heavy lifting this time round. Now, we probably want to see these plans in the upcoming one-year spending review, but the government could still provide greater clarity on its broad approach and guidance on when it expects to set out its plans, which could help councils with their medium-term financial strategies. Now, the government will set baseline budgets for next year, at least, including for councils. And given uncertainty about how the COVID-19 crisis will evolve, I wouldn't expect these to be final figures. As in the current year, top-ups could be made to budgets as it becomes clearer what the scale of the ongoing impacts are. So the figures we see published later this month, I think will be far from the end of the story for funding in 2021-22, and we'll have to wait even longer to get the longer-term spending plans. Looking further ahead, decisions need to be taken on not only the level of funding, but also the form of funding for councils. Will we raise revenues nationally and distribute it to councils in the form of extra grant funding? Or will the responsibility and power be delegated to councils to raise more locally? Now, the answer to this question, I think, requires a trade-off between how much we prioritise local discretion and responsibility on the one hand, and how much we value consistency of taxes and service provision across the country on the other. Now, the last decade has seen more emphasis on local discretion and responsibility, and alongside that, a shift to more locally raised revenues. Councils rely much more on council tax and business rates, and to some extent fees and charges and commercial income than they did a decade ago. And there are plans to go further down this route. I think it's really interesting to see whether there still is the appetite for that in a post-COVID world, which has shown that as well as giving more flexibility and more sort of local accountability, there are also risks involved with greater reliance on sort of local revenue raising, especially when the kind of flexibilities councils have around borrowing are quite limited. The government will also need to decide whether to progress funding reforms already in train, such as with business rates and updates to the way council spending needs and funding allocations are decided in what it calls the Fair Funding Review. Now, these reforms were due to come into effect next April, and we know that won't happen, but we don't know whether these reforms are just postponed or whether they've been shelved entirely. The government has kept its options open so far. Now, it could use the opportunity alongside the spending review, or perhaps the finance settlement just afterwards, to provide some clarity to local government on that. Will they go ahead with these reforms? Now, in my view, the Fair Funding Review really has to go ahead. At the moment, we don't really have a coherent way to allocate funding between councils currently. And COVID could end up not just affecting different places in different ways in the short term, but in the long term too. So it'll be very important to have a funding system that can reflect, the changes in relative needs of different parts of the country as the longer term impacts of COVID become clear. So, we need to have the fair funding review, and it needs to take account of the fact that things have changed over the last few months, and that could persist going forwards. And lastly, I think we need a clear understanding of the role of local government in two major areas of public policy. First, in setting policy for and organising and delivering local public services such as social care and public health, the bread and butter of councils historically. And second, in economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and the broader levelling up agenda. And I think one of the things we've seen illustrated over the last few months with the COVID crisis is the tensions that exist between, on the one hand, a desire for greater local control and discretion, on the other, the simplicity and consistency of national rules and standards. We saw that around lockdown, around the different decisions that councils are making about which businesses to offer discretionary support to. But these tensions are not new. My feeling is that for several years now, funding policy, whether it's focused on local revenues and incentives for growth, has been pulling in a somewhat different direction to debate and policy on local services like schools and social care, where the debate really has emphasised consistent funding arrangements, a national funding formula, common standards, common eligibility criteria. But how do you square that circle of unequal revenues with equal provision? So my final thought is that looking ahead, I think that means central and local government need to be clear about what they're trying to achieve over the next several years and in the longer term. Not only what level of service provision, but also how that should be varying across the country, the balance between local responsibility and national standards. And then try to make sure that expectations, policy, and funding levels and systems are truly aligned. Right, okay, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you. Now, before I hand over to our panelists, just a little plug for our website, where you can see all our research and our council COVID dashboard that I mentioned earlier. But without further ado, I'll hand over to our first panelist, who will give the LJ's perspective on some of the key financial issues facing councils.
Thank you, David. So we've got quite a range of people from a diverse set of organisations in the session this afternoon. So I thought I'd just very briefly start with what is the LGA. We're a politically led cross-party membership organisation, but I will add that I am not a politician, I'm an officer that works for the LGA. And we are the national voice of local government in England and in Wales. So I want to sort of set out what it is that we want from the government during this year and next. And I'll just touch on some of the figures that David mentioned, but don't worry, I'm not going to repeat those all. So as David said, there's about £8.2 billion of pressures arising due to COVID-19 in this financial year. 5.4 billion of those are costs and 2.8 billion of those are non-tax losses. And as David said, once you take into account the grants that have been provided so far, the sales fees and charges compensation scheme, which does not compensate for all income losses, then we end up with a gap of around £1 billion. Now that's just this year. So as David also said, there's an impact on council tax and business rates that businesses and people are paying, and that amounts to about £3.1 billion. Now, the way the local government finance system works means although those payments were due this year, they will impact on local authority budgets in the next financial year, so from April 2021. And I'll just add, because I'm sure a lot of people will be aware that the government has announced lots of reliefs for businesses in the retail, hospitality and leisure industries, meaning that they have not had to pay business rates in this financial year. That £3.1 billion does not include that. So the government actually compensates local authorities for those businesses not paying any business rates this year. So this is an additional £3.1 billion on top of those that have already got the reliefs, which have been compensated for. So it's also true to say that some of that income might be recoverable at some point, perhaps this year, perhaps into next year. But, you know, I think, as David pointed out, we don't know how this is going to pan out in terms of impacts on the economy, impacts on people's jobs. And so it's difficult to say what that will be at this stage. And central government has said that it will, at the spending review, announce how it will share those council tax and business rate losses with local government. So we'll all be looking to the 25th of November to see how much of that is going to be picked up by local government and how much by central government. But in the meantime, they have announced, and they've just laid the regulations, that instead of all those losses hitting local authority budgets next year, that they will allow them to share them equally across a 3-year period, which will help. So we've heard a lot from David about uncertainty, about, you know, how the pandemic is going to pan out, what measures might be needed to help stem the pandemic, and how that affects the economy, people's jobs, the high street and so on, as well as the sort of longer term impacts in terms of what behaviour has this changed. So these returns, as David said, they're based upon monthly returns of local authorities to MHCLG. They provide a really rich source of information for the government and for us, but they are pre-Tier 3 and pre-national lockdown. So we will be looking very closely at the next set of returns to come in the next few weeks and months to see what they are saying in terms of lost costs. Lost income and extra costs. But all this uncertainty makes it very difficult for local government to plan. Local government has got to plan its services, and obviously it has to plan its finances, because a local authority legally has to balance its budget. It cannot go into deficit, so it cannot spend more than the available resources that it's got. And as we've heard, this comes on top of a really challenging few years for local government. The impact of funding reduction since 2010, which we estimate is about £15 billion of lost core government funding since 2010. So in addition to what the IFS has done, and adding some things that we've been working on, we estimate that local government is going to need £5.8 billion from April next year. Now, I'm not saying give us back that 15 billion that's been lost. This is about looking ahead to where costs might go, where income might go, based on the sort of services local authorities were providing before COVID, but recognising that costs will be higher, and they may be providing to more people because the population is expanding. So that's just to provide the same sorts of services they're providing now. It's not for new or for better services. And then we're also asking for just under £3 billion to meet some new burdens and some service improvements in early intervention, for example, things around adult social care, pay parity with the NHS. So overall, that means we're asking central government to provide local government with £8.7 billion from April next year. Now, we were expecting a multi-year spending review that would set the path of local government and central government funding for the next 3 years. And so as part of that, we were asking central government to provide £10 billion in 23-24. So Given there's lots of uncertainty around the extra costs and the income losses arising from COVID-19, we're actually asking for a guarantee from central government to meet all those costs and to meet all those income losses, whatever they may be, and to meet them this year, but also to meet them next year as well. So that's not just about the fact that those council tax and business rate losses will impact in the next financial year and be spread over a further 2 years, but also about the longer term impacts of COVID-19 on costs and income losses. Of course, we welcome the financial support that's already been provided. It is significant, but as David said, we will need more. And we also think that local authorities will need other financial freedoms to help them through this period as well, such as capitalisation, so the ability to use capital receipts, so generated perhaps from selling an asset, for revenue purposes, for the day-to-day running purposes, recognising that that's not a long-term solution to funding revenue services. So I just sort of want to come back to the uncertainty point. So local government is facing a 1-year spending review. That means another 1-year settlement, the third 1-year settlement in a row. So we're not just asking for a guarantee of costs and income losses arising from COVID-19 to be met in full, but also local government needs certainty on all of its funding. We've had a look at core spending power, which for those of you who are not familiar with that term, is the revenue funding that's available to local government on an annual basis, which includes business rates, council tax and some key grants. It doesn't include everything. And of that core spending power, there's uncertainty around 95% of that. So right now, your local authority, and many of you will work for local authorities will be aware of this, your local authority is starting to budget for April next year, because if you need to make savings, you can't just flick that switch and make those savings straight away. They take time to deliver. But when you've got that level of uncertainty, it's very difficult to plan services when you don't know how much money you're going to have available to you. So in addition to meeting the cost of COVID-19, we're also asking for central government to provide local government with a sort of minimum funding guarantee, so the amount of funding that a local authority gets in April 2021 will be the minimum amount that it will have available for the rest of this Parliament. And that's where I'll finish and hand over to our next speaker. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Richard. So hopefully we have Richard standing ready. Excellent.
Hi, Helen. Thank you. Sorry, forgive me, I wasn't sure if you were going to introduce me or not. So building on what Nicola says, I should introduce myself. My name is Richard Watts. I'm leader of Islington Council. I also chair the Local Government Association Resources Board. So I speak for the RGA on money issues, which is no small job at the moment, given the pressure on local government over the last 10 years that David set out. But I was going to talk a bit about both what that pressure means for local government nationally, but also drawing on my own authority in Islington, what that means very specifically in Islington and the kind of things we've spent money on during the COVID crisis and the kind of choices that we face going forward as a result. And clearly, as Nicola said, and David have both said, and the graphs bear this position out very strongly, building on 10 years of very, very significant pressure, COVID comes along just at the point things were supposedly going to get better. And given and I think what's often lost is all of the additional spending pressures there are on local government as well. So in my own authority, it costs us somewhere between £9 and £12 million each year to basically do the same thing each year. So unless your funding goes up by 9 to 12 million quid each year, so basically it's a real terms cut, and that comes from pay rises, and God alone knows local government staff need a pay rise after 10 years of kind of below, what in my view, below the going rate pay rises. of contract inflation and demographic pressures, simply more and more people needing both children and adult social care. And it is that rising demand for the most intractable, complicated and expensive services that has been, I think in itself, a offshoot of austerity, and there is something pretty circular about that. And B, it's very, very damaging for councils' finances, and the councils that have really struggled with that, and David gave an example of one of them, are the ones that are now in real pressure. And I think it's also worth saying there is an enormous correlation in the councils that have really struggled financially in the last 10 years, and I won't name names, but you only have to read the media to figure that out, all of which have been correlated with a very, very significant problems in their children's services. And I think that's so. But where do we go now? So to give you an impression about my own borough, which is, I would like to think, relatively, we are pretty reliant on parking income, and historically we've had low reserves. But broadly, we are a well-run authority. We balance the books each year. We don't run deficits, and therefore we're on pretty good shape to come through this crisis. But to give you a bit of a sense for a well-run authority, what the kind of pressure is. We think the total combination of income losses and additional costs before we get on to lockdown 2 ran in at about £59 million for Islington. And we've had about, so far, £27.5 million of government financial support to fill that gap. We anticipate we're going to get more through the income loss scheme, which covers for broadly about half the loss of income that councils face. But that will still leave a pretty significant gap in our council's finances at the end of the year. Now, it's a bridgeable gap. We're not at any risk of going bankrupt, but it's very stark. But I want to give you some of the, just so people don't think we've been wasting our money, I want to give you some sort of sense of where all that extra money has gone and where all the loss of where all the kind of loss of income has come from. Because I think there's a view around that loss of income primarily comes from reckless commercial investments in shopping centres and petrol stations out of borough. And it's not that at all. I mean, to knock that one on the head really, really quickly, because it's a wholly misleading impression. So the kind of extra spending we've seen as a council, we spent £2 million on PPE, both for the local authority and for adult social care providers in our area. We spent about £2 million on IT projects to enable the kind of massive workforce shifts to home working and other things. We've lost on about £2 million, just over £2 million from money that we've not been able to deliver in planned savings that were on track to be delivered but can't now be because of the crisis. We've spent almost £6 million extra on managing hospital discharges from adult social care. Clearly, absolutely critical. We play our role in the national effort to free up hospital capacity to treat people with COVID. No argument about that. That's coming at a very significant cost to councils as well as to the NHS. We'll pay that without griping, but it's a real problem. And all the way down to kind of 130 grand to pay for pay for free school meals for kids. So not university, but on the national entitlement scheme. Caused by the kind of failure of the government to fund that last week. So it's, there's very, very significant out-of-pocket expenditure. The kind of income losses we've faced, though, is about almost £10 million on various related parking expenditure, although that's actually recovering more quickly than we anticipated initially. That may now go back down again because of lockdown 2, but that's clearly, for some boroughs like Islington, a significant loss of potential income. £4.5 million from leisure centres, £500,000 on loss of kind of events in hiring of parks and things like that. About £2 million from loss of services, whether it's commercial waste, licensing, energy services, highways, street markets, and pest control, and a whole range of other kind of sundry, long-term traded services. About 2.8 million lost in nursery fees, given the council runs a large number of very well regarded and oversubscribed council nurseries. That's a very significant loss of income to us indeed. £2.5 million of housing rent arrears, and £1.6 million on kind of registrar's income, given the number of weddings at Islington Town Hall and events we run in our assembly hall. So as you can see, none of the money from this is, none of this is kind of lavish or risky commercial spending, is all of which is a council just trying to make ends meet in difficult circumstances by trying to use its assets well and trying to run up, trying to run income where we can kind of get it. And I think it's commonly misunderstood that when we talk about council income losses, we are talking about the small number of councils that have done those kind of big high profile bits of spending elsewhere, and that's overwhelmingly not the case. Overwhelmingly, where councils have lost income, it is from this kind of core provision of traded services that have made up part of the local government funding mix for years. So what can we do to make this, what do we do to make this better?
Sorry, Richard, if you wrap up quickly, about sort of half a minute, and then we need to move on. Thank you.
Certainly, Helen, I'll do that very quickly. So what do we do to make this better? So firstly, there is clarity. What do we need is clarity on what we're going to get for next year. I'm trying to set a council budget at the moment, and I simply have no idea how much money we're going to get next financial year, let alone in years after that. We need to know that kind of yesterday. Secondly, is we need the income guarantee money paid out ASAP, but frankly, we need that scheme to become more generous so it does cover all of the cost of our lost income, which would seem only fair. Thirdly, we need clarity over the collection fund deficit in council tax and business rates that hits us like a train next year if we don't get proper support for that. And thirdly, we need to continue to provide extra funding as we go through lockdown 2, take account of the costs of that, and then potentially face further restrictions that hit council income in the future. So all of those things should be doable, and the government should live up to its promise to, quote, fund councils to do whatever it takes that was issued at the beginning of this crisis. Thank you, Helen.
Hi, Helen, I'll come straight in. I think
that's great. Yeah, if you jump into Cromwell.
So I'll be as quick as I can and try and make up some time so there's more time for Q&A and discussion. So firstly, forgive me if I'm looking to the right, just because I've got my crib sheet on another screen. Secondly, in way of intro, I also work with Nicola in the LGA's finance and policy team. I lead on local growth and transport policy. So very quickly, just want to reflect back briefly on where we were. So following last year's general election, councils were already on high alert in terms of thinking about economic resilience and future growth. Brexit and the potential future deal with the EU were about to become a reality. The talk nationally was about rebalancing the economy to benefit left behind areas. And we were talking about tackling, the climate emergency. These were all sort of high on the agenda. Alongside this, the new government was promising to unleash innovation, productivity, sustainability, and technology right across the UK. And then bang, come February, March, COVID-19 changed everything. And the sheer magnitude of the impact became pretty apparent across the economy, impacting on the everyday lives of people in the country. So sort of locally, we started to see commercial property sector facing an avalanche of changing demand patterns. Hospitality and large proportion of retail absolutely turned on its head, not only due to restrictions, but also changing working practices. Retail went overwhelmingly online as traditional venues were forced shut and shoppers felt nervous about going out. Travel and tourism taken a huge hit in terms of being largely shut down internationally, and restrictions to business practices also meant that domestic businesses couldn't fully capitalize on that. Impacts go further on aviation. If you look at Heathrow, dependent on over 100,000 jobs. And then you have knock-on effects as well down the supply chain if you look at aviation manufacturing. And many others are suffering, such as in the service economy, arts, hairdressers, beauticians, all facing a pretty uncertain future. And the impact has been felt throughout supply chains. Many places have seen a disproportionate impact on self-employed, young, female, seen Black and minority ethnic communities also impacted disproportionately in many places. And there have been knock-on impacts in relation to things like childcare, caring responsibilities. The other unique aspect of COVID is that many companies have been forced to rapidly change their business practices just to survive. If staff can work from home, then why do we need an office at all? Other businesses have sought to pivot or reinvent their business models to survive, going online. restaurants offering takeaway services, etc. And the impacts locally have been felt pretty variable. So we've seen David's graph sort of across the country, but even within a local authority area, between residential, neighbourhood and commercial centres. So are we starting to see companies that use the earlier lockdown to innovate pulling ahead, whereas those in mothball are finding it more challenging? I think we probably are to some extent. And just looking at the role of councils, well, clearly we have a very strong interest and significant role to play in helping local economies recover. We've been doing this for decades, if not for forever. And the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions on society, local economies, is expected to be severe. We're already seeing that impact playing out, and it's yet to be fully felt. We've got winter approaching, lockdown 2, all heaping further restrictions on public gatherings and hospitality businesses at local level. This is going to be a very challenging time for local authorities, councils, in managing both their immediate priorities, but together with undertaking some sort of forward planning and thinking for supporting that longer term local economic recovery. And let's not forget, economic development is a discretionary service. This is not a service that councils need to provide. And we know that over the austerity years, councils have had to retrench from what they do. And what many have done is have to pool and invest their limited resources to perhaps a slightly bigger geography at the LEP level in many areas. And no doubt the loss of income will have an impact on all discretionary services, including economic development. And there's an issue here in terms of longer term funding. Government sort of been talking about, throwing sort of more capital funding around or expediting capital funding. But the problem often tends to be not just capital funding. Often councils have regard themselves as being quite capital rich, but revenue poor. And this is really where we need some extra support. And just to reflect back on the last 6 months, councils have had to not only respond to COVID-19 on their own services, but also in developing new services and working at pace. So we've had to get to grips with new system of distributing grants, business grants, and then to helping high streets to open safely. And we've also had to deal with new grants ourselves that we've received, sometimes to very onerous and restrictive rules. So those who have had the pleasure of dealing with the Reopening High Street Safely Fund will know some of the challenges that they've faced on that and how time consuming some of that has been. It will remain challenging, as I've said, for councils to both take a long-term look ahead and help their economies and businesses recover, but there will of course be opportunities as well. Today we've had some good news on a potential vaccine, but what will that mean in terms of being able to return to normality? It was interesting just looking at the stock market and how that reacted to that news today. I think the stock market was up by over 300 points or something along that order. But it's interesting to see which stocks have gained ground: aviation, hospitality, etc., cinemas, which stocks have not done so well. So the ones that have actually done well during the pandemic are now predicted to do not as well. The sort of likes of home food delivery, grocery deliveries, Ocado, Zoom stocks went down as well today. So just reflecting back quickly at David and his graphs show that the impacts will be variable. But if we're going to go thinking ahead at sort of returning back to some sort of normality, what will that actually mean in different areas? This is something that councils will have to take a close look at themselves for their own areas. Will things go back to how things did before? Which businesses will survive? Where will the growth opportunities be? Undoubtedly, some businesses and industries will have changed forever, but councils also need to ask what type of local economies do they and their residents want in future. If it's greener, then what can they do to make that happen? Similarly, how can they ensure that recovery is a much more inclusive one? And then looking back at the high streets and town centres, what sort of high streets and town centres do they want? How can councils help to repurpose them? So these are some of the things that we are hearing from councils, and also where they would like some support. And this is where we are looking to shape our support over the coming months. We're already got some work underway on dealing with empty retail units, what councils could potentially do, how they can intervene, but also some work looking at sort of good practice around local economic recovery. We'll shortly have some guidance coming out, good practice guidance coming out on green financing as well, particularly of sustainable projects. So I hope these sorts of things that will help councils, and just invite you to look out for them. I'll leave it there and hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kamal. Everything's been said, but not everybody has said it. So let me just say two very brief things, try to deal with the short term and then some of the longer term issues that David was touching on. So as we know, the short term economic impacts of COVID have been felt pretty much everywhere across the country. All of our cities, all of our large towns have been negatively affected. You know, places like Blackpool and Hull and Birmingham that were struggling to some degree beforehand, but also places like Luton, Slough and London. So when we think about dealing with the very immediate, very short run effects, you know, when we think then about skills and training development, you know, that's going to need to play out, and that's going to have to happen everywhere, and local authorities everywhere are going to have a big role to play in that. And I think we can look back to the New Deal period in the early 2000s or late 1990s, early 2000s to tell us something about the role that local government can play in delivering and organising various employment related services to deal with what is going to be quite a large unemployment shock that is already upon us, but certainly will be upon us, I think, into 2021. So there's a sort of short run problem and challenge, I think, that local authorities will have to get more involved in, and government will have to see them as critical and important partners in doing that, and not to resist their involvement in some respects in the way that they have in dealing with the health aspects of the COVID crisis. But, and it's a big but, you know, we know that there are big economic challenges, which is why we have the Levelling Up agenda, big economic challenges for this country. Productivity growth has been pretty poor for the best part of a decade, if not longer. We have large spatial variations between some places in the country and other places. Those issues predate COVID quite considerably, and they need to be dealt with, which, as I said, is why we need the Levelling Up agenda. And there, I think, you know, we have to think carefully about how the government is allocating its money into these kind of places. And I think there will be a need to be a greater degree of prioritization than previous. Governments like to jam spread. That's not particularly useful, I think, when you're trying to prioritize investment into those places that have economic assets that can be further utilized. So we will need a degree of prioritization from the government. We've already heard, and I would agree, that local government as an important institution will require more money, more funding and more certainty, certainly more than it's had over the last decade. And I think the government should continue to take an advantage here, notwithstanding COVID, to continue to push the devolution agenda. Yes, we have a devolution white paper that is currently frozen. That needs to be unfrozen pretty rapidly and clearly communicated. But since there is still a desire and a need to go further on the devolution agenda and push more powers and autonomy and responsibility down to local government and to collections of local government as well, there's no reason to pause or to reverse the devolution agenda because of the COVID crisis. In many respects, we need to go further and faster. And then I think there is a reform question, reform agenda. David alluded to it. You know, there is a reform for local government finance. I think council tax, we well know, is long overdue a reform. We've put out some work about reforming the business rates to make it a more efficient and more effective funding income stream for local government, and indeed to support investment. So there is things that, again, that the government can be pushing in regards to that as well. And as I said, I think the Levelling Up agenda remains as important, if not more important, than it has been, irrespective of COVID. And I'll finish there so we can get into questions and answers. So back to you, Helen.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for that. So I want to just jump straight in with some of the questions and discussions. I think there's lots to say. And I really want to pick up on this, on the kind of the bleak outlook, I think, for the kind of the revenues and the finances and the kind of how do we plug those gaps? Because looking at the questions on Slido, they're all effectively about that and how we meet those challenges. So Nicola, perhaps if I can start with you. One of the questions was really about, can you unpack what some of the numbers you gave us? I think you gave us the 8.7 billion needed from April next year. Can you unpack a little bit about kind of why that's needed, how it differs across different areas, and perhaps a little bit about kind of how certain are you that, what happens if government doesn't give you that money? How bad do things get?
Thank you. Yes, an excellent question, but not that easy to answer in some respects. So, so the numbers that I was referring to are partly based upon David's work at the IFS on looking at the services that local authorities are providing at the moment and estimating forward costs. So we know that population is rising, therefore local authorities will need to provide services to a larger number of people, and recognising that costs will just go up because they do anyway due to inflation. But they have built into their figures how much council tax will go up by, which I think was 2%, and also that there'll be some increases in grants, which if those don't happen, then obviously that funding gap grows. So looking at the sort of 8.7 billion of cost pressures, that was 23-24, then adding on 1.7 billion around the adult social care provider market, which we have estimated that, and others have come out with very similar figures, and then some pension costs, which the IFS estimates for us. That gives us a 5.3 billion funding gap, just to retain services at the level that they are now. And then when we add in the significant overspend and persistent overspend in children's social care of £1 billion, 0.7 billion needed to meet the concessionary fares funding shortfall, that's how we get to adding a nearly 2 billion with some other things on there as well, such as homelessness and building safety, new burdens. And then in terms of the sort of £3 billion, 1.7 billion of that is for early intervention funding. And then there's a significant burden in terms of reforming adult social care pay to pay the social care people the same amount of money that NHS workers are getting for very similar roles. So local, in terms if we don't get that, well, I mean, local authorities will have to manage within their budgets, and that's something that Richard and his colleagues in Islington and everywhere around the country has managed to do during a period of austerity from 2010. But they are innovative as well in sort of the things that Richard was saying in terms of generating income from other sources, which is not, as Richard was very clear on, about being commercial for commercial sake, but providing services and charging for those services where we're able to do that. So it is a challenging period ahead. Obviously at the LGA we're pushing for central government to meet all of those costs, as well as the sort of costs arising from COVID-19.
Great, thank you. Can I turn to you, Richard? Because there's a couple of questions here from Adrian Jenkins, basically about council tax and business rates. So thinking really about how local governments can fund themselves. One question is about, should council tax be higher than 4% to fund social care? Can business rates survive in the medium run and help fund local authorities? I mean, what kind of sources of financing do you think we need for local governments?
I'll give you the LGA view, and I'll give you a sneak peek into my personal thoughts as well, if that's all right. So I think the LGA is looking at its position on both council tax and business rates. I think we agree that there are some challenges with the business rates as a long-term tax. I mean, they are self-evident, and you only have to listen to any of the business groups talk about the business rates regime to understand some of the problems with it. However, you are going to need some sort of property tax on business, because property is very, very hard to hide, whereas profits are pretty easy to hide, and therefore property, some form of property tax is a really sound basis for future taxation. But I think we're happy to have a debate about what the details of that are. I mean, my personal view is we need to have a similar debate about personal taxation as well. I think council tax increases are a really bad way of funding the social care costs in the country. I mean, councils will accept a adult social care precept on council tax if the government offers that. I think that will be helpful next year in managing the ongoing costs of COVID. But given the demands of where social care are highest, are not in the same areas of the country about where precepts raise the most amount of money. There is a considerable, precepts generate significant surplus in some areas, and in areas like mine generate, still very, fill in less than 10% of the whole in the annual adult social care budget. And, just to give you an example of why that's really, a bad way of doing things, Islington, adult social care in Islington, we probably need to generate about 10 million of savings and efficiencies each year in order to keep the show on the road. And we're doing that okay. However, a 1% increase in council tax raises us just under £1 million a year. So unless you're looking at precepts of £10 million a year, whatever you do to council tax, and I don't, 10%, and I don't think anyone is, whatever you do to council tax is not going to be sufficient to fund adult social care for the future. And the government does need to come up with the long-awaited white paper and start that genuine cross-party discussion that we've all been waiting for so long.
Great, thank you. So Kamal, I'm going to jump to you. So our top question here by Roman is basically about other powers authorities could have. So he says, what local authorities won't they need more liberalised funding and accounting regimes to balance their budgets over 5 years rather than 1 year? So thinking about other things they could do, like do they need more borrowing powers? What other things do local governments need in order to help them meet the challenges that Richard's just been talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in terms of, certainly around policy, and I think some softer things would help is around, around policy, but also around that certainty of funding as well. I think is going to be really important. It's a point that we constantly make. So we're so used to having funding on a 1 year basis, and it's so fragmented. I think we did a piece of work last year or recently that we counted, I think, 11 different funding streams for just for roads alone. It doesn't make any sense. We get Highways England, Network Rail, they get 5-year funding envelopes, and they decide largely how to best spend that. And yet we are given very, very much sort of fragmented funding. So we're asking for, longer term certainty, and it's exactly what the National Infrastructure Commission have said as well. So there's that. There are other things which I know some councils are looking at, which in the toolbox that exists at the moment, things like workplace parking levy, which only so far one council has explored, which is Nottingham, and is doing very well out of it. So there are things that councils can do, I think, to sort of find some different revenue streams as well. But I think the challenges of finances have already been well laid out by both Nicola and Councillor Watts. So I think that in the toolbox at the moment it's a bit limited, but there are a few more things that we could still push at, I think.
Great, thank you.
Right.
Sorry. Yep. We've run out of time, so very quickly, because I want to make sure we ask Andrew a question as well.
No, I was going to say, I think this kind of question about borrowing specifically is an interesting one. Historically, councils haven't had the borrowing power to borrow for day-to-day spending. As Nicola was saying, they have to balance their budgets. Each year has been a core part of the local public finance system. I think looking ahead, if councils are relying more on, local revenue streams that can be more volatile, more risky, you would want to see, potentially more flexibilities to manage that risk. I think the challenge is, how do you kind of do that in a way that doesn't sort of undermine the sort of, really strong budget control we've seen councils be able to exert? So I think that if we do get on the route of more borrowing powers, we need to make sure it's in kind of a framework that sort of still maintains this sort of, very strong credibility and very strong, budget management that councils have been able to deliver. But I think it is worth, having that debate about, more local discretion on borrowing.
Thanks, David. So Andrew, I want to pick up on the point you're making that I think is interesting about the devolution agenda and your view that we should just keep pushing in that direction. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether that would be good for all areas. So I can see how some areas, especially some cities, obviously really want that. I can see how they have, you know, strategies and plans. But some areas, I wonder if do they have the capacity to take on a sort of a more devolved set of policies? And are we really comfortable as a country, do you think, with seeing big divergences across areas, with some doing very well and some struggling? I mean, devolution sounds great when we have it. Are people going to regret that we have it?
Yes, great question. The obvious point is we have a relatively centralized system now, and yet we have, by OECD standards, some of the most stark regional variation in performance across public services and indeed certainly the economy. So the idea that we don't have this kind of, you know, postcode lottery or whatever you want to call it now is balmy, because in a sense everybody knows that we do. So we don't need to defend that false position. I think secondly, you know, devolution I think would benefit nearly all places. What we probably need to be careful about and considered about is how much devolution crudely and of what type to different places. You know, I think this, you know, the asymmetric, you know, messy approach to devolution, actually I'm in favor of that. In part, that's kind of responding to local capacity questions and issues. But my final point would be, you know, I think we ought to think about devolution, the process, as a means to drive and improve capacity. In a sense, you know, the devolving of responsibility across the different pieces on policy and on funding is a means actually to drive capacity in our local government. Alongside, I think we would need to think about, you know, reform of the local government sector in over the next 5 to 10 years in order to respond to that. But you can use devolution to do that. So, you know, it's not one size fits all, etc. But I think you know. Everywhere benefits from devolution, and you can use it as a capacity enhancing process as well.
Great, thank you. I think it's kind of exciting. I think we can have some goods come out of devolution and kind of like solving the future. So we're running over. I have 1 more minute to say to David. David, do you want to kind of come back on any of the points about devolution, the sort of looking for the challenges to face? Richard mentioned we're sort of all looking for, hoping there's going to be kind of more answers out there, more ideas about how we fund local government. What are you looking for in the next couple of years from government?
Yeah, well, I actually think that, you know, I agree with a lot of what's been said in the last few minutes. I think where we're at now is that, you know, we recognize everyone recognizes some of the issues that we face. We do have a system which, you know, is quite centralized in terms of revenues and decision making, but we also are sort of, you know, sometimes moving further in that direction in terms of kind of our policy objectives, you know, around schools, around social care, around actually the response to the COVID crisis, which, you know, has been pretty centrally driven. So I guess what I would like to see is, you know, as we look ahead, recognition that actually what council's doing now is not what they might end up being, you know, for in 5-10 years time. I think we could see a situation where councils take on more responsibilities for certain things like, you know, local economic development, local growth, local skills, local transport, the levelling up agenda side of things. And it may be the case, if we really do want social care services, which have very consistent standards, very consistent eligibility, very consistent funding arrangements across the country, maybe the role of local government in that changes. So I think what we need to really do is actually, you know, almost start from a blank sheet of paper. What would we have local government doing, you know, so that it's, you know, really satisfying what we think as a country, you know, what services should be the same, what services can differ, you know, what is the role of local government? I think we start with that sheet. We can't forget we start where we are, but at least having that blank sheet, what we want to end up at, will give us a clear sense of direction, and therefore all our policies on levelling up, on social care, on funding, on local government reorganisation, at least they're in the same direction. It'll be a long, hard slog, but at least we'll be slogging, you know, in one direction rather than pulling in different directions.
Well, I'm sad we have to leave it there, because I'd love to now have a discussion about what local government should do and how we do devolution, what the future looks like. So maybe I need another event to come back and talk about all these things. But for now, let me close because we are over time. And let me thank everyone who's spoken today, because I at least have found it fascinating. Thanks to everyone who's listening, to everyone who's engaged with us. And I say, please do come back and keep engaging, because obviously these are hugely important topics that are going to be around with us for years, if not decades